The gunshot that tore through the still desert air marked the beginning of Josephine Fletcher's life in Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, 1882. She had never meant to kill a man, but as the stagecoach robber collapsed in the dust with her father's old Colt smoking in her trembling hands, she knew there was no going back to the refined Boston existence she'd left behind. The hot Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Josephine stood frozen, the weapon still extended before her. The other passengers, a traveling salesman, an elderly couple, and the wounded driver, stared at her with a mixture of awe and horror. The second robber had fled, leaving his partner bleeding out in the sand. "Miss," the driver managed through gritted teeth, clutching his arm where a bullet had grazed him, "you just saved all our lives." Josephine lowered the gun slowly, her ivory gloves now stained with gunpowder. I only meant to frighten him." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The elegant traveling dress that had seemed so practical in Boston now clung to her uncomfortably in the desert heat, and her carefully pinned chestnut hair was coming loose around her face. "Meant to or not, you did what needed doing," the elderly gentleman said, helping his wife back into the stagecoach. "Though I reckon folks around here might look at you differently now." How prophetic those words would prove to be. 3 days later, Josephine sat alone at the far corner of the Silver Spoon Cafe in Redemption Creek, the whispers around her growing louder with each passing hour. News traveled fast in small towns, especially news about a proper Eastern lady who could handle a gun like a seasoned gunslinger. "They say she shot him clean through the heart at 20 paces. Eastern women ain't supposed to know about firearms. Something unnatural about a woman who can kill so easily." Josephine stared into her cooling tea, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had come west to take up the teaching position at the newly established school, to make a respectable living after her father's death had left her with little more than debts and his old service revolver. Now it seemed she had ruined any chance of being accepted before she'd even begun. "More tea, Miss Fletcher?" The waitress, a plump woman named Harriet, approached with a pot. "No, thank you. I should be going." "How much do I owe?" Josephine began gathering her belongings. "On the house today, miss. You've had a rough start." Harriet's kindness was unexpected. "That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly take it while it's offered," came a deep voice from behind her. "Folks aren't always so charitable in these parts." Josephine turned to find herself looking up into the most striking pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a tall man, broad-shouldered and sun-bronzed, with wheat-colored hair that curled slightly at the ends. He wore simple work clothes, a faded blue shirt, sturdy trousers, and well-worn boots, but carried himself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir." Josephine straightened her posture, determined to maintain whatever dignity she had left. "Forgive me," he said, removing his hat to reveal more of that golden hair. "Forrest Landry. I run the ranch north of town." He didn't extend his hand, which struck Josephine as odd until she realized most of the town was watching their interaction with undisguised interest. "Josephine Fletcher, the new schoolteacher," she stood, gathering her reticule. "Or at least, I was meant to be." Forrest's expression revealed nothing. "I heard about what happened on the road, nasty business." "Yes, well," Josephine swallowed hard. "It seems my arrival has been somewhat more eventful than anticipated." A hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "That's one way of putting it." He gestured toward the door. "May I walk you to your lodgings? There are some things about this town you should know." Josephine hesitated. In Boston, walking unaccompanied with a strange man would be scandalous. but she was beginning to realize that the rules of Boston society held little sway in the Arizona territory. "Thank you, Mr. Landry. I would appreciate that." As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street. Redemption Creek was a modest settlement, one main street lined with essential businesses, a few side streets with residences, a small church, and the schoolhouse where Josephine was meant to teach. "The school board is meeting tonight," Forrest said as they walked. "They're discussing your position." Josephine's heart sank. "Because of the shooting," he nodded. "Some folks are uncomfortable with the idea of a woman who's killed teaching their children. It was self-defense. He was going to shoot the driver, he'd already wounded him." "I know that," Forrest said calmly. "And reasonable people understand. But this town has its share of unreasonable people too." They stopped in front of the small boarding house where Josephine had taken a room. She turned to face him, suddenly angry. "So I'm to be punished for saving lives? For not allowing myself and others to be robbed or worse?" Forrest studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You really don't understand what's happening, do you? Enlighten me, Mr. Landry. It's not about what you did, it's about what you are." His voice dropped lower. "A beautiful, educated Eastern woman who can handle a gun when needed. You represent everything they fear. Change, independence, strength in a form they don't recognize as proper." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks, both at his casual mention of her being beautiful and at the unfairness of it all. "That's absurd. That's human nature." He replaced his hat. "The meeting's at 7 at the town hall. I'll be there." "Why would you attend?" "Do you have children in the school?" A shadow passed over his face. "No, but I believe everyone deserves a fair hearing." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Fletcher." Josephine watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him quickly down the street. She had no allies in this town, no one to speak on her behalf. Perhaps this mysterious rancher would be the exception. The town hall, a grand name for a modest building that also served as the courthouse when needed, was packed by the time Josephine arrived that evening. She had changed into her most conservative dress, a high-necked navy blue affair with minimal trimming, her hair severely pinned back. If they wanted proper, she would give them proper. The whispers followed her as she made her way to an empty seat in the back row. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, ignoring the stares that seemed to burn into her skin. Mayor Wilson, a portly man with an impressive mustache, called the meeting to order. "As you all know, we're here to discuss the appointment of Miss Josephine Fletcher as our new schoolteacher in light of recent events." Reverend Thomas stood immediately. "I must object to placing our children in the care of a woman with blood on her hands. The good book teaches us that women should be gentle, nurturing creatures. What kind of example would Miss Fletcher set?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Josephine gripped her reticule tighter, forcing herself to remain composed. "The stage driver would be dead if not for her quick thinking," came another voice. "It was Dr. Matthews, the town physician. I treated his wound. The bullet would have struck his heart if the robber had gotten off another shot." "That may be," said Mrs. Prescott, whose husband owned the general store, "but there's something unnatural about a woman who can shoot like that. My Herbert says she must have had improper training." "Improper training." "My father was a Union officer who believed his daughter should be able to protect herself." Josephine found herself standing, the words pouring out before she could stop them. "Would you prefer I had allowed that man to kill the driver, perhaps rob and assault the rest of us? Would that have been more proper?" The room fell silent. Then Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. "Miss Fletcher, while we appreciate your forthrightness, this meeting is to allow the board to discuss my fate without allowing me to speak in my own defense." Josephine's voice remained calm despite her racing heart. "Is that the justice you practice in Redemption Creek?" From the corner of her eye, Josephine saw Forrest Landry stand up from his seat along the wall. "The lady has a point, Mayor. Seems to me we owe her the courtesy of hearing her out." Mayor Wilson tugged at his collar. "Very well. Miss Fletcher, you may address the board." Josephine took a deep breath. "I came to Redemption Creek because I believe in education. I believe that knowledge is the greatest gift we can give the next generation. Yes, I killed a man, and I will carry that burden for the rest of my days. But I did so to protect innocent lives, the very same instinct that would lead me to protect your children should harm ever threaten them." She looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. "Judge me not by one terrible moment, but by my intentions and my capabilities. I am a qualified teacher. I can instruct your children in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and the sciences. I can prepare them for a changing world. All I ask is the opportunity to prove my worth." The silence that followed was deafening until a slow clap began from the back of the room. It was Forrest, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that might have been admiration. "Well said," he remarked, then addressed the board. "I don't have children in the school, but I pay taxes that support it. I say we judge Miss Fletcher on her teaching, not her ability to protect herself and others." "Easy for you to say, Landry," called out a man Josephine didn't recognize. "You live out on that ranch of yours, away from decent folk. Some of us have to think about the moral character of those influencing our young ones." Forrest's jaw tightened. "And what exactly are you implying about my character, Jenkins?" The tension in the room shifted, and Josephine sensed there was history here she didn't understand. Mayor Wilson banged his gavel. "That's enough. We'll take a vote among the school board members only." He looked at the 5 board members seated in the front row. "All in favor of retaining Miss Fletcher as schoolteacher, raise your hands." 2 hands went up immediately. Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly widow whose late husband had been the town's previous mayor. Those opposed? Reverend Thomas raised his hand, as did Mr. Peterson, who owned the bank. It came down to the 5th member, Mr. Roberts, who ran the livery stable. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the other board members. "Mr. Roberts," the mayor prompted. "Aye. Well." He glanced at Josephine, then at Forrest, who was watching him intently. "I suppose everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves. I vote in favor, provided there's a probationary period." Josephine nearly sagged with relief. Mayor Wilson didn't look pleased, but he nodded. "Then it's decided. Miss Fletcher will begin her duties as planned, with a review of her performance in 1 month's time." The meeting adjourned with a bang of the gavel, and people began filing out, some still muttering their disapproval. Josephine remained seated, needing a moment to collect herself. "Congratulations, schoolteacher," Forrest said, approaching her seat. "You won the battle, but the war's just beginning." "Thank you for your support, Mr. Landry, though I'm not sure why you offered it. Let's just say I understand what it's like when people make up their minds about you without knowing the whole story." He offered her his arm. "May I escort you back to your boarding house?" The walk back was quieter this time, the streets mostly empty as night settled over Redemption Creek. Josephine was acutely aware of Forrest's arm beneath her gloved hand, the solid strength of him beside her. "They'll be watching you closely now," he said as they approached the boarding house. "Every lesson, every word, every gesture." "I'm accustomed to scrutiny," Josephine replied. "Though I admit the standards seem somewhat inconsistent here," Forrest chuckled. "That's putting it mildly." He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Word of advice: lock your door at night. That second robber who got away, there's talk he might have friends in these parts." A chill ran down Josephine's spine. Do you think I'm in danger? I think a woman who can shoot like you is never completely defenseless, he said with a hint of admiration. But caution never hurt anyone. I'll keep that in mind. She hesitated. Mr. Landry, may I ask why people seem to react to you the way they do? There was clearly some history with that man Jenkins at the meeting. Forrest's expression closed off. Small towns have long memories, Miss Fletcher. Some things are hard to live down. He tipped his hat. Good night. I'll check in on you when I'm next in town. Before she could press further, he was gone, striding away into the darkness. Josephine's first day at the schoolhouse dawned bright and clear. She arrived early, wanting to ensure everything was in order before her students arrived. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. A blackboard covered most of the front wall, and a pot-bellied stove stood in the corner for the winter months. She had just finished writing welcome students on the blackboard when the door opened and a young girl of about 10 entered, her blonde hair in neat braids. She carried a small posy of wildflowers. Good morning, Josephine said with a warm smile. You're early. The girl approached shyly, holding out the flowers. These are for you, Miss Fletcher. Mama said we should make you feel welcome. Touched, Josephine accepted the small bouquet. Thank you very much. They're lovely. What's your name? Emma Matthews. My pa is the doctor. Ah, then, I have your father to thank for his support last night as well. Emma looked down at her shoes. Pa says you did what any brave person would do, but Reverend Thomas said at Sunday service that women shouldn't handle firearms. Josephine considered her words carefully. The world isn't always simple, Emma. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we must make difficult choices. What's important is that we try to do what's right, even when it's hard. She placed the flowers in a jar of water on her desk. Now, would you like to help me prepare for the day? By the time the school bell rang at 8 o'clock, 17 students had arrived, ranging from 6 to 15 years old. Josephine noted with disappointment that there were at least 10 empty desks children, whose parents had clearly decided to keep them home. Good morning, class, she began, determined to focus on those who had come rather than those who hadn't. I am Miss Fletcher, your new teacher. We have much to learn together, but first, I'd like to learn about all of you. The morning passed quickly as Josephine assessed the students' varying levels of education. Some of the older boys, particularly Henry Jenkins, son of the man who had confronted Forrest, at the meeting seemed determined to test her authority with whispered comments and barely concealed smirks. But Josephine had taught in Boston before coming west. She was no stranger to classroom management. At noon, she dismissed the children for their lunch break, watching as they scattered across the schoolyard with their lunch pails. She was about to return inside when she spotted a familiar figure on horseback approaching the school. Forrest Landry rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, the powerful animal responding to his slightest command. He dismounted with easy grace, tying the horse to the hitching post before approaching her. Mr. Landry, she greeted him, aware of the curious stares from her students. What brings you to town so soon? Brought in some cattle to sell, he explained, removing his hat. His hair was damp with sweat and dust clung to his clothes. Thought I'd see how your first day was going. It's going well, though some parents have kept their children home. He nodded, unsurprised. They'll come around when they see you're just teaching reading and writing, not sharpshooting. Despite herself, Josephine laughed. I don't think sharpshooting is in the approved curriculum. Pity, might make arithmetic more interesting. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. I see young Jenkins is here. Having any trouble? Nothing I can't handle. His father's been spreading talk about you and about me for supporting you. Josephine frowned. I'm sorry to have caused you difficulty. Don't be. Jenkins has hated me for years. This is just a convenient excuse." He glanced at the children in the yard. "I should let you get back to your duties. Just wanted to check that everything was all right." "It's kind of you to be concerned." Something flickered across his face. "Kind isn't a word people usually associate with me, Miss Fletcher. Perhaps they don't know you very well." "Perhaps they know me better than you do." He put his hat back on. "Good day, Miss Fletcher." She watched him ride away, wondering about the shadows that seemed to follow this man who had become her only ally in Redemption Creek. The following weeks fell into a pattern. Each day, Josephine taught her growing class, more parents grudgingly sending their children, as reports of her teaching abilities spread. Each evening, she returned to her small room at the boarding house, prepared lessons, and sometimes walked through town or read on the porch if the weather was fine. And at least twice a week, Forrest Landry would appear in town on some errand or another, inevitably finding a reason to pass by the schoolhouse or the boarding house. Their conversations were brief but increasingly comfortable, though he remained guarded about his past and personal life. One Saturday, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Josephine was shopping at the general store when she overheard a conversation from the next aisle. "Can't believe she's still associating with that Landry fellow after what Mrs. Peterson told her," a woman's voice said in hushed tones. "Some women don't have the sense God gave them," replied another. "Though what can you expect from someone who'd shoot a man dead?" "Well, I heard he's been visiting her boarding house at all hours. Probably only a matter of time before she shows her true colors." Josephine rounded the corner, facing the two gossips, directly Mrs. Jenkins and her friend Mrs. Collins. "Good afternoon, ladies. I couldn't help but overhear my name being discussed." The women had the grace to look embarrassed, though Mrs. Jenkins quickly recovered. "We're only concerned about the moral example being set for our children, Miss Fletcher." "How commendable," Josephine replied coolly. "Though I wonder why your concern doesn't extend to teaching them about the evils of bearing false witness." "Mr. Landry has never visited my boarding house at all hours, as you put it. Our conversations have been brief and entirely in public view." Mrs. Collins sniffed. "Even being seen with him damages your reputation. Mrs. Peterson was trying to do you a kindness when she told you about his past." "Mrs. Peterson has said nothing to me about Mr. Landry's past," Josephine replied, genuinely confused. The women exchanged glances. "Well," said Mrs. Jenkins with poorly concealed relish, "perhaps someone should." Before Josephine could respond, the store's bell jingled as the door opened, and Forrest himself walked in. The women immediately busied themselves with examining canned goods, shooting dark glances in his direction. Forrest nodded to Josephine, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Miss Fletcher." "Fine day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Landry," she replied, watching the ladies from the corner of her eye. "I was just finishing my shopping." "Allow me to help you carry your purchases," he offered, taking the basket from her hands. "I'm headed back toward town anyway." As they left the store together, Josephine could practically feel the disapproving stares burning into her back. Outside, the October sun was warm but not unpleasant, the worst of summer's heat finally abating. "You shouldn't have done that," she said once they were out of earshot. Forrest looked down at her, puzzled. "Done what?" "Offered to escort me. Those women were already gossiping about us." Understanding dawned on his face. "Ah, you're worried about your reputation." "I'm worried about my position," she corrected. "The school board's review is in less than a week." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Do you want me to stay away from you, Miss Fletcher? Will that make things easier?" Josephine hesitated. The truth was, she had come to look forward to their brief encounters, to his dry wit and unexpected insights. In a town where most people still regarded her with suspicion, he had been a consistent ally. "No," she admitted finally, "but I would like to understand why my association with you is considered so problematic. What is this past that Mrs. Peterson should have warned me about?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "It's not a story for the middle of Main Street." "Then where?" "When?" He considered for a moment. "Tomorrow's Sunday. Do you attend church services?" "I have been, yes." "Meet me afterward. I'll take you for a drive and we can talk properly." He handed her basket back. "For now, I think it's best if you finish your errands alone." Sunday morning found Josephine sitting rigidly in the church pew, trying to focus on Reverend Thomas's sermon rather than the whispers and glances directed her way. The Reverend had chosen to preach on the virtue of meekness, a choice Josephine suspected was not coincidental. "Blessed are the meek," he intoned, his eyes seeming to linger on Josephine, "for they shall inherit the earth." The Lord favors those who know their place, who accept with humility the roles he has ordained for them. Josephine kept her expression neutral, though inside she was seething. Nothing in her reading of Scripture suggested that God intended women to be defenseless or subservient. Her father, a deeply religious man despite his military career, had taught her that strength and faith were compatible virtues. After the service, she made polite conversation with a few parents of her students, conscious that many eyes were watching her interactions. When most of the congregation had dispersed, she spotted Forrest waiting by a handsome buggy at the edge of the church grounds, away from the remaining parishioners. "You didn't attend the service," she observed as she approached. "The Reverend and I have theological differences," he replied dryly, helping her into the buggy. "Primarily about who's welcome in his church." He climbed in beside her and took up the reins, guiding the horse away from town and toward the open countryside. They rode in silence for a time, the buggy wheels crunching over the packed dirt road, mesquite and sagebrush stretching out around them beneath a vast blue sky. "Where are we going?" Josephine finally asked. "Nowhere in particular. Just somewhere we can talk without an audience." He glanced at her. "Are you comfortable? The sun's getting warm." "I'm fine." She adjusted her bonnet slightly. "Mr. Landry, I'd like to know what everyone in town seems to know except me." He sighed, his hands steady on the reins. "I suppose I owe you that much, since you've been dragged into it." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I came to this territory in '75 after the war, bought land north of what would become Redemption Creek, started building my ranch. I kept to myself mostly, worked hard." The town grew up slowly around the creek. Josephine listened intently, watching his profile as he spoke. In '79, a young woman named Sarah Blackwood came to town with her father. He was opening a new saloon, pretty girl about 19. His voice took on a distant quality. "We courted for a time. Her father didn't approve, wanted her to marry someone with money and connections, not a rancher still building his spread. But Sarah was determined." He guided the horse around a bend in the road. "We planned to marry that spring. But in February there was an incident in town. A group of drunks started causing trouble at the saloon. I wasn't there when it began, but I arrived as things were getting ugly. One of them had Sarah cornered. His knuckles whitened on the reins. I intervened. There was a fight. One of the men pulled a knife, a local tough named Harris. When it was over, Harris was dead, and I had a knife wound in my side." "Self-defense," Josephine said softly. "That's what the territorial judge ruled, but Harris was Jenkins's cousin. And Mr. Blackwood decided I was too dangerous for his daughter. He forbade her from seeing me, threatened to disown her." Forrest's voice grew flat. "Sarah chose her father's fortune over our future. A month later, she married Peterson's son, the banker's boy who'd been sweet on her all along." The same Peterson who sits on the school board. Who voted against me? Forrest nodded. The very same. Sarah died in childbirth a year later. The baby too. Pain flickered across his face. Some in town, Jenkins and his crowd especially, claim I put a curse on her by touching her. Say any woman I get close to is doomed. Josephine stared at him, appalled. That's superstitious nonsense. Of course it is. But grief and hatred make people believe strange things. He pulled the buggy to a stop atop a small rise that offered a view of the surrounding landscape. In the distance, Josephine could just make out a cluster of buildings that must be Forrest's ranch. They call me Death Touch behind my back. Say I'm unfit for decent company, especially women's company. And that's why my association with you is considered inappropriate, Josephine said, understanding dawning. Not just because of your past violence, justified as it was, but because of this ridiculous superstition. The violence alone would be enough, he said with a humorless smile. I've killed 3 men in total: Harris, a rustler who tried to steal my cattle in '80, and a drunk who drew on me in Tucson last year. Each time ruled justified, each time adding to my reputation. He turned to look at her directly. So now you know what Mrs. Peterson would have told you. That I'm dangerous. That I bring death to women who get close to me. That I'm unworthy of decent society. Josephine held his gaze steadily. I've killed a man too, Mr. Landry. Perhaps we're both unworthy by their standards. Something shifted in his eyes, surprise and perhaps a flicker of hope. You're not afraid of me, should I be? No. The word came quickly, firmly. I would never harm you, Miss Fletcher. Then I see no reason to avoid your company based on town gossip and superstition. She adjusted her gloves. Though I understand now why it might be prudent for us to be less visible in our association, at least until after the school board's review. He studied her for a long moment. You're unlike any woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment, she replied with a small smile. It was meant as one. He picked up the reins again. We should head back before your absence is noted. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the landscape rolling by around them. Josephine found herself stealing glances at Forrest's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught in his hair. May I ask you something personal? She ventured finally. Seems only fair given what I've shared. Why did you help me? That first day and at the meeting. You had no reason to involve yourself in my troubles. He considered her question carefully. When I heard about what happened on the stagecoach, how the town was already judging you, it reminded me of how quickly people made up their minds about me. How they never looked past that one violent moment to see anything else. He shrugged slightly. And maybe I recognized something in you, a kind of solitary strength, the look of someone who does what needs doing, regardless of the cost. The words touched something deep in Josephine's heart. I think perhaps we understand each other, Mr. Landry. I think perhaps we do, Miss Fletcher. The school board's review came and went without incident, with no complaints about her teaching methods and clear evidence that her students were progressing well. Even Reverend Thomas and Mr. Peterson had to grudgingly vote to maintain her position. Josephine threw herself into her work, expanding the curriculum to include more advanced subjects for the older students, and organizing a small library corner with books donated by Dr. Matthews and a few other supporters. True to their understanding, she and Forrest maintained a careful distance in public. He still came to town regularly, but their interactions were brief and formal. Yet Josephine found herself watching for him, a flutter of anticipation in her chest whenever his tall figure appeared in the distance. One crisp November afternoon, as Josephine was dismissing her students for the day, Emma Matthews lingered behind. Miss Fletcher, may I ask you something? Of course, Emma. Josephine smiled at her favorite pupil, a bright girl with a quick mind and endless curiosity. Is it true that Mr. Landry is courting you secretly? Josephine nearly dropped the book she was organizing. What? No. Who told you such a thing? Emma twisted her hands in her skirt. I heard my mama telling my aunt that you and Mr. Landry have an understanding, but have to keep it quiet because of what people would say. Your mother is mistaken, Josephine said firmly, though her cheeks felt warm. Mr. Landry and I are merely acquaintances. Oh. Emma looked disappointed. I thought it was romantic, like a story. Mr. Landry always looks at you special when he thinks nobody's watching. Before Josephine could respond to this startling revelation, there was a commotion outside, shouts and the sound of horses arriving at speed. She moved quickly to the window, Emma following behind. 3 riders had pulled up in front of the general store across the street. They were rough-looking men, trail dusty and heavily armed. Who are they? Emma asked, pressing closer to the window. I don't know, Josephine replied, unease prickling along her spine. Emma, I think you should run along home now. Quickly, please. She ushered the child out the back door of the schoolhouse, watching until Emma was safely on her way toward the doctor's house. Then Josephine returned to the front window, observing as the 3 strangers dismounted. One of them, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, seemed to be giving orders to the others. There was something familiar about him that nagged at Josephine's memory. Where had she seen that distinctive scar before? The realization hit her like a physical blow. The stagecoach robbery. He was the second robber, the one who had escaped. The one Forrest had warned might have friends in these parts. Heart pounding, Josephine grabbed her reticule with her father's pistol tucked safely inside and slipped out the back door. She needed to alert the sheriff, but his office was on the other side of the street, past where the men were gathered. She would have to circle around. She had just reached the alley behind the row of buildings when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she found herself face to face with the scarred man, his eyes widening in recognition. Well, well, he drawled, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. If it ain't the lady shooter herself, saved me the trouble of hunting you down. Josephine backed away slowly, one hand reaching into her reticule. What do you want, Justice, madam? He spat the word. You killed my brother that day on the stage road. Billy wasn't much, but he was blood. Your brother was robbing a stagecoach and about to murder the driver, Josephine said, trying to keep her voice steady. The territorial judge ruled it justified. Judges, he scoffed. What do they know about justice between folk? He drew his pistol with practiced ease. An eye for an eye, that's real justice. A life for a life. Josephine's fingers closed around her own weapon, but before she could draw it, a voice rang out from the end of the alley. That's far enough, Maddox. Forrest stood there, his own gun already drawn and pointed steadily at the scarred man. Maddox's face twisted with anger. Landry, should have known you'd be mixed up with this murdering woman. Put the gun down and walk away, Forrest said, his voice cold and controlled. This doesn't have to end badly. It ended badly the moment she shot Billy, Maddox snarled, but his gun hand wavered slightly. Your men are already being detained by the sheriff, Forrest continued, taking a step forward. You're alone. Think about your next move carefully. A tense silence stretched between them. Josephine held her breath, acutely aware that she was standing between 2 armed men, both capable of violence. Finally, Maddox lowered his gun slightly. This ain't over, he growled. Not by a long shot. It is for today, Forrest replied, not lowering his weapon. Now drop the gun and kick it toward me. With a curse, Maddox complied, then raised his hands in surrender. You can't watch her forever, Landry. Sooner or later I'll get my due. Not in this lifetime. Forrest kept his gun trained on Maddox as he approached, quickly retrieving the dropped weapon. "Miss Fletcher, would you be so kind as to fetch the sheriff? Tell him we have the third member of the Maddox gang." Josephine hurried to do as asked, her heart still pounding. By the time she returned with the sheriff and his deputy, Forrest had Maddox seated on a crate, hands bound behind him with a length of rope. "Good work, Landry," the sheriff said, hauling Maddox to his feet. "We've been after this one for months, wanted in 3 territories." As the lawman led Maddox away, Josephine found herself trembling, delayed reaction setting in. Forrest was at her side immediately, a steadying hand at her elbow. "Are you hurt?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "No, I'm fine," she managed. "Just shaken." "How did you know he was here?" "That he would come after me." "I didn't know for certain," Forrest admitted. "But there were rumors about the Maddox gang being in the area. When I rode into town and saw strangers' horses, I got worried. Asked around and heard they were asking questions about a lady teacher." His jaw tightened. "I got to the schoolhouse just as I saw him follow you into the alley." "You saved my life," Josephine said softly. "You'd have drawn your own weapon if I hadn't arrived," he countered, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "But I'm glad I was here all the same." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Josephine was suddenly very aware of Forrest's hand still on her arm, of how close they were standing, of the dozens of eyes watching them. "Miss Fletcher," Emma came running up, her father the doctor close behind. "Are you all right? Papa says that bad man wanted to hurt you." Josephine knelt down to the child's level, forcing a reassuring smile. "I'm perfectly fine, Emma. Mr. Landry and the sheriff made sure the bad man couldn't hurt anyone." Dr. Matthews looked between Josephine and Forrest, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps you should come to our house for a bit, Miss Fletcher. My wife could make you some tea, and you could rest until the excitement dies down." "Thank you, doctor, but I think I'd prefer to return to my boarding house." She straightened up, smoothing her skirts with still shaking hands. "I'll escort you," Forrest said, in a tone that brooked no argument. He offered her his arm. This time, Josephine didn't hesitate to take it, no longer caring what the townspeople might think. As they walked away from the curious onlookers, she leaned slightly into his solid strength. "Everyone will talk," she murmured. "Let them," he replied, covering her hand with his free one. "Some things are more important than gossip." At the boarding house, Mrs. Wilson, the proprietress, fussed over Josephine, insisting she take a medicinal brandy for her nerves. Forrest declined to enter, mindful of propriety despite the day's events. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he promised, still standing on the porch. "Try to rest." "Mr. Landry," Josephine said impulsively, "thank you. Not just for today, but for believing in me from the beginning when no one else would." Something powerful flashed in his eyes. "You're a woman worth believing in, Josephine." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Josephine sat at the small desk in her room writing a letter to her aunt in Boston, the only family she had left. She had been sending regular updates about her new life, carefully editing out the more dramatic aspects. But tonight, she found herself writing the full truth about the stagecoach robbery, about the town's initial rejection, about Forrest. "I find myself drawn to him in a way I've never experienced before," she wrote, her pen hesitating over the words. "He is not what would be considered a suitable match in Boston society. He has killed men. His reputation here is complicated at best. And yet," she paused, struggling to articulate the connection she felt with this complex, solitary man. "And yet there is a fundamental decency in him, an integrity that transcends the violence in his past. When he looks at me, I feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in my life. Not as a proper Boston lady, not as an oddity who can handle a gun, but simply as myself with all my contradictions and complexities. She set down her pen, rereading what she had written. Was it merely gratitude she felt toward Forrest Landry? Or something deeper, something that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure? The following weeks brought changes to Redemption Creek. The capture of the Maddox gang, long the scourge of stagecoach lines throughout the territory, was big news. The fact that the woman teacher had been instrumental in identifying the leader, and that Forrest Landry had apprehended him, created an unexpected shift in how the town viewed them both. Children who had been kept from Josephine's classroom began to appear, their parents grudgingly acknowledging that a teacher who had faced down outlaws might have something valuable to impart about courage and quick thinking. Even Reverend Thomas tempered his sermons about female propriety, perhaps recognizing that his congregation's views were evolving. Most significantly, Josephine's friendship with Forrest became openly acknowledged. He would often meet her after school, walking her back to the boarding house or escorting her on errands. Sometimes they would take longer walks outside of town, discussing books, sharing memories of their vastly different upbringings, or simply enjoying the spectacular Arizona sunsets. Yet for all their growing closeness, there remained a careful distance between them. Forrest never touched her beyond offering his arm or occasionally, briefly, her hand. He never spoke of feelings beyond friendship. Josephine told herself this was proper, appropriate, and tried to ignore the longing that grew in her heart with each passing day. December arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and preparations for Christmas. The schoolhouse was decorated with paper chains and pine boughs, and Josephine organized a Christmas pageant for the students to perform for their parents. On the day of the pageant, the schoolhouse was packed with families. Even parents who had initially objected to Josephine's appointment came to watch their children perform the nativity story and recite poems about the season. Josephine stood at the back of the room, watching proudly as her students, even reluctant Henry Jenkins, who had been persuaded to play one of the wise men, performed their parts with enthusiasm. She was so focused on ensuring everything went smoothly that she didn't notice Forrest's arrival until he was standing beside her. "They're doing well," he said quietly, his eyes on the children. "They've worked so hard," she replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "Even the ones who struggled with reading at the beginning of term. That's your doing." She glanced up at him, startled by the warmth in his voice. "It's their hard work, guided by your teaching." He smiled down at her. "You've changed this town, Josephine, more than you know." The way he looked at her with such undisguised admiration made her heart flutter. Before she could respond, the pageant concluded, and the room erupted in applause. The moment was lost in the rush of parents congratulating their children and thanking Josephine for her efforts. Later, after helping to tidy the schoolhouse, Josephine found Forrest waiting outside with his buggy. The evening air was crisp, and the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky. "I thought you might appreciate a ride back to town," he said. "It's getting cold for walking." "Thank you," she said, accepting his help into the buggy. "It was kind of you to come to the pageant. I wouldn't have missed it." He settled beside her, arranging a warm blanket over her lap before taking up the reins. "Besides, I wanted to ask you something." "Oh." "Christmas is in 2 weeks," he began, his eyes on the road ahead. "I usually spend it alone at the ranch, but this year, well, I was wondering if you might do me the honor of joining me for Christmas dinner." Josephine felt a rush of pleasure at the invitation. I would like that very much. It won't be fancy, he warned. My housekeeper, Mrs. Diaz, makes a fine meal, but it's not what you'd be used to in Boston. Mr. Landry, she said gently, my Christmases in Boston were often quite lonely affairs after my father passed. A simple meal with a friend would be far preferable. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then it's settled. He hesitated, then added, and Josephine, I think after all we've been through, you might call me Forrest when we're not in company. Forrest, she repeated, liking the feel of his name on her tongue. Yes, I think I can manage that. The ride back to town seemed all too short. When they arrived at the boarding house, Forrest helped her down from the buggy, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment they stood close together in the gathering darkness, neither quite ready to part. Thank you for the ride, Josephine said softly, and for coming to the pageant. It meant a great deal to me. Josephine, he began, his voice low and intent, but whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by Mrs. Wilson opening the front door. Miss Fletcher, there you are. You have a visitor waiting in the parlor, been here nearly an hour. Puzzled, Josephine looked back at Forrest. I should go see who it is. Of course. He stepped back, the moment broken. Good night, Josephine. Good night, Forrest. Inside, Josephine removed her bonnet and gloves, wondering who could be calling on her at this hour. As she entered the parlor, a tall, elegantly dressed man rose from the settee. Her heart sank as she recognized him. Richard, she said, her voice flat with surprise. What on earth are you doing in Arizona territory? Richard Harrington, the son of her father's former business partner and her almost fiancé in Boston, smiled his familiar, charming smile. Is that any way to greet an old friend who's traveled thousands of miles to see you? How did you even know where I was? Your aunt, of course. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his before she could object. Josephine, you've been greatly missed. Your sudden departure left many questions unanswered. She withdrew her hands firmly. I left a letter explaining that I had accepted a teaching position out west. There was nothing sudden about it. I had been applying for positions for months after it became clear that my father's estate left me little choice but to support myself. Richard's handsome face took on an expression of concern. That's exactly what troubled me. There was no need for you to exile yourself to this wilderness. He glanced around the modest parlor with barely concealed disdain. I was prepared to offer for you, as you well know. You were prepared to offer after my father died and left debts, rather than the fortune you had assumed would come with me as your wife, Josephine corrected coolly. Forgive me if I found the timing suspect. He at least had the grace to look slightly abashed. Perhaps I should have made my intentions clearer earlier, but I'm here now, Josephine. I've come to bring you home. Home? She stared at him in disbelief. This is my home now, Richard. I have a position here, responsibilities, students who depend on me. Surely they can find another teacher, he dismissed. Josephine, be reasonable. A woman of your background, your refinement, doesn't belong in a place like this, teaching common children living in such reduced circumstances. He lowered his voice. There are rumors, disturbing rumors, about your involvement with violence, about your association with a known gunman. Anger flared hot within her. You've been in town less than a day and already listening to gossip. I arrived on the afternoon stage. Naturally, I made inquiries about your situation while waiting for you to return. His expression grew serious. What I heard concerns me greatly. This man Landry, he's dangerous, Josephine. Unsuitable company for a lady. You know nothing about Forrest Landry, she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Nothing about what kind of man he truly is. Richard's eyebrows rose at her use of Forrest's given name. I see the rumors of your familiarity with him aren't exaggerated. "Josephine, think of your reputation." "My reputation," she laughed without humor. "My reputation here was established when I shot a man to save innocent lives, when I stood my ground against prejudice and superstition, when I proved myself as a teacher and a woman of principle." She drew herself up to her full height. "I'm not the same woman who left Boston, Richard, and I have no intention of returning." He stared at her for a long moment as if seeing her for the first time. "You've changed." "Yes," she agreed simply. "I have." "At least give me the courtesy of considering my offer," he pressed. "I'll be staying at the hotel for a few days. We could speak again when you've had time to think." Josephine was about to refuse outright when Mrs. Wilson appeared in the doorway. "Miss Fletcher, I must insist that your visitor depart. It's getting quite late and we do have rules about calling hours." "Of course," Richard said smoothly, reaching for his hat and gloves. "My apologies for the intrusion. Good evening, Mrs. Wilson. Josephine, I'll call on you properly tomorrow." After he had gone, Josephine sank onto the settee, her mind whirling. Richard's appearance was the last thing she had expected or wanted. His presence threatened to complicate her life just when it had finally begun to settle into a pattern that felt right. What troubled her most was the thought of Forrest learning about Richard's arrival and misinterpreting it. Would he believe she had a suitor from her past, that she might be leaving Redemption Creek? The idea of causing him pain was unbearable. The next morning, Josephine rose early, determined to speak with Forrest before Richard could make his promised call. But as she descended the stairs, Mrs. Wilson informed her that Richard was already waiting in the parlor. "He arrived at the very earliest acceptable hour," the older woman said disapprovingly. "Most insistent young man." With a sigh, Josephine entered the parlor to find Richard examining a book from the small shelf in the corner. He looked refreshed and impeccably dressed, as if the journey west had been no more taxing than a stroll through Boston Common. "Good morning, Richard," she said formally. "I'm afraid I can't entertain you for long. School begins in an hour, and I have preparations to make." "Of course," he said, setting the book aside. "I thought perhaps I might accompany you to the schoolhouse and observe your teaching methods. I've always had an interest in education." The thought of Richard scrutinizing her classroom, evaluating her as if she were a curiosity on display, made her bristle. "That won't be possible today. The children are working on special Christmas projects and visitors would be a distraction." Disappointment flickered across his face, quickly replaced by determination. "Then perhaps you'll allow me to escort you there, and may I call on you this evening? We have much to discuss." Josephine recognized the strategy to be seen publicly with her, to establish himself as a suitor in the eyes of the town, to stake a claim. "Richard, I meant what I said last night. I have no intention of returning to Boston." "And I have no intention of giving up so easily," he countered smoothly. "Not when I've come all this way." Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't create a scene, the parlor door opened again, and Mrs. Wilson appeared. "Miss Fletcher, Mr. Landry is here to see you. Shall I tell him you're engaged with another visitor?" Richard's expression darkened at the mention of Forrest's name. "No, please show him in," Josephine said quickly, relief flooding through her. Forrest entered the parlor a moment later, his tall frame making the room seem suddenly smaller. He wore his usual practical attire, a clean but well-worn shirt, sturdy trousers, and boots that had seen many miles. Beside Richard's tailored Eastern clothing, he should have appeared rough, unpolished. Yet to Josephine's eyes, Forrest possessed a natural dignity that made Richard's carefully cultivated elegance seem artificial by comparison. "Good morning, Miss Fletcher," Forrest said, his eyes taking in the situation at a glance. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Not at all, Mr. Landry. Allow me to introduce Mr. Richard Harrington of Boston, an old acquaintance. She deliberately avoided terms like friend or anything that might suggest a closer relationship. Richard, this is Mr. Forrest Landry. The two men sized each other up with the wariness of territorial predators. Richard extended his hand first, a social obligation he couldn't avoid without appearing overtly rude. Mr. Landry, I've heard a great deal about you in my short time here. Forrest's handshake was brief but firm. Can't say the same, Mr. Harrington. Josephine hasn't mentioned you. The use of her given name was deliberate. Josephine knew a subtle claim of intimacy that Richard couldn't miss. Indeed, his mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Fletcher and I have a long history in Boston, Richard replied. I've come to persuade her that her future lies there, not in this frontier settlement. Is that so? Forrest's voice remained even, but Josephine could see the tension in his shoulders. Seems to me Miss Fletcher is more than capable of deciding her own future. Quite right, Josephine interjected, stepping forward. And I've already made my decision clear, Richard. My life is here now. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. We'll discuss this further when we're alone, Josephine. Actually, Forrest said, I came by to escort Miss Fletcher to the schoolhouse. We have a matter to discuss regarding the Christmas festivities. It was a transparent excuse, but Josephine seized it gratefully. Yes, thank you for reminding me, Mr. Landry. Richard, if you'll excuse us. Richard looked as though he wanted to object, but years of social training prevailed. Of course. Perhaps we could meet for dinner at the hotel this evening. I'm afraid I have papers to grade, Josephine replied, gathering her things quickly. Good day, Richard. Outside, the morning air was brisk and clean, a welcome relief from the tense atmosphere of the parlor. Forrest offered Josephine his arm, which she took gratefully. Thank you, she said quietly as they walked. Your timing was impeccable. Who is he really? Forrest asked, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of something Josephine couldn't quite identify. Concern. Jealousy. The son of my father's business partner, she explained. After my father died, Richard offered marriage conveniently after learning there was no fortune to be had. I declined and came west instead. Forrest was quiet for a moment. And now he wants you back, so he says. She sighed. I think his pride was wounded when I refused him. Richard isn't accustomed to being denied what he wants. Are you sure that's all it is? He glanced down at her, his expression guarded. He's a man of your world, Josephine. Educated, wealthy, polished. The kind of man a Boston lady would be expected to marry. Josephine stopped walking, turning to face him directly. Is that what you think I want? To return to Boston society and its suffocating expectations. To marry a man who sees me as an appropriate accessory to his ambitions rather than a person in my own right. Forrest's eyes searched hers. I think you deserve every happiness, whatever form that takes. And I wouldn't blame you if you sometimes missed the comforts and security of your former life. The only security in that life was the security of knowing exactly what was expected of me to be decorative, agreeable, and ultimately subservient to my husband's wishes. She shook her head fiercely. I found something far more valuable here: independence, purpose, the freedom to be myself without apology. A hint of a smile touched Forrest's mouth. And the freedom to shoot stagecoach robbers, despite everything, Josephine laughed. That was hardly planned, but yes, I suppose so. They resumed walking, a more comfortable silence between them now. As they approached the schoolhouse, Forrest spoke again. Will you tell him about what happened with Maddox? About the stagecoach? He already knows, or at least the town's version of it, Josephine replied. He mentioned disturbing rumors about violence and about, she hesitated, about your association with a known gunman, Forrest finished for her, his voice dry. Yes. She looked up at him apologetically. He doesn't understand this place or the people in it. He sees everything through the lens of Boston propriety. And how do you see things, Josephine? The question was soft but weighted with significance. They had reached the schoolhouse steps. No students had arrived, yet she was early as usual. Josephine turned to face Forrest, gathering her courage. I see a man who has been judged unfairly by those who don't know him, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. A man of honor and principle who has stood by me when others wouldn't. A man who makes me feel. She faltered, then pushed on. Who makes me feel understood and valued for exactly who I am. Something powerful flared in Forrest's eyes. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air. Josephine, he began, his voice rougher than usual, I've tried to keep my distance, to be just a friend to you because that's what I thought you needed. What would be proper? But if there's a chance that you might feel something more. I do, she whispered, her heart pounding. I have for some time. He reached up slowly, giving her time to withdraw, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. They say I'm unworthy of touching something so pure, he said, his voice barely audible, that I bring death to what I love. Josephine leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. Then let me touch heaven, she replied, because loving you could never bring me anything but life. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them. Then Forrest lowered his head, and his lips met hers in a kiss so tender, it brought tears to her eyes. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and hers found their way around his neck, propriety forgotten in the joy of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them for months. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Forrest rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day you stood up to the town council and told them exactly what you thought of their judgment. Josephine laughed softly. And I've wanted you to since you walked me home that same evening. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. What about Harrington? He won't give up easily, I suspect. Let him try, she said with newfound confidence. I know my own mind and heart. The sound of approaching children's voices reminded them of where they were. Forrest stepped back reluctantly, though he kept hold of her hand. I'll come by the boarding house this evening, he said, to make our understanding official if that's what you want. It is, she assured him. Very much so. He lifted her hand to his lips. Until then. As Forrest walked away and her students began to arrive, Josephine felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Richard's persistence, the town's lingering prejudices, the hardships of life in the territory, she would face them with Forrest beside her. For the first time in her life, she had found someone who saw her strength as a virtue rather than a flaw, who valued her independence rather than seeking to curtail it. She had found home, not in a place, but in a person who let her be herself completely. That evening, Richard was waiting on the boarding house porch when Josephine returned from school. His expression was determined, his posture rigid with resolve. I must speak with you privately, he said without preamble. What I witnessed this morning was concerning. I don't believe we have anything further to discuss, Richard, Josephine replied, trying to move past him to the door. He blocked her path. Josephine, you're not thinking clearly. This place, these people, they've confused you. That man Landry is dangerous. Everyone in town knows it. Everyone in town is wrong, she said firmly, and I would appreciate it if you would step aside. I can't let you throw away your life on some frontier killer. Richard's controlled facade cracked, revealing genuine distress beneath. Your father would be horrified. The mention of her father stung, but Josephine held her ground. My father taught me to judge people by their character, not by gossip or reputation. He would have respected Forrest Landry far more than he ever respected you, Richard. Richard flinched as if she had slapped him. You don't mean that. This isn't you speaking, it's this wild place. It's changed you. Yes, she agreed. It has, for the better. She stepped around him decisively. I won't ask you again to move aside. Is there a problem here? The sheriff stood at the bottom of the porch steps, his thumbs hooked in his belt near his holstered gun. No problem, Sheriff, Josephine said quickly. Mr. Harrington was just leaving. Richard glanced between Josephine and the lawman, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he stepped back with a stiff bow. This conversation isn't finished, Josephine. I believe it is, she replied, then nodded to the sheriff as she entered the boarding house. Inside, Mrs. Wilson was hovering in the hallway, clearly having observed the confrontation through the window. Are you all right, Miss Fletcher? That young man seems most persistent. I'm fine, thank you, Josephine assured her. And I'm expecting Mr. Landry this evening. Would it be possible for us to use the parlor? Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. Of course. Though I should tell you, tongues are already wagging about you two after this morning. What do you mean? The older woman's expression softened into something almost maternal. You were seen kissing outside the schoolhouse, dear. Mrs. Jenkins was taking her laundry to the washerwoman and happened to pass by. Josephine felt her cheeks warm. I see. For what it's worth, Mrs. Wilson continued, I think Mr. Landry is a fine man, despite what some might say. He's always been proper and respectful in my establishment. And the way he looks at you, she smiled. Well, a woman my age recognizes true feeling when she sees it. Touched by this unexpected support, Josephine impulsively squeezed the landlady's hand. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. That means a great deal. Now go freshen up. I'll send Mr. Landry in when he arrives. Forrest arrived precisely at 7, dressed in what Josephine recognized as his best clothes, a clean black coat over a white shirt, dark trousers, and boots polished to a shine. His hair was neatly combed, and he had trimmed his beard. He looked handsome and slightly nervous, which she found endearing. Mrs. Wilson showed him into the parlor, where Josephine waited, similarly having taken extra care with her appearance. She wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, her hair arranged more elaborately than usual. You look beautiful, Forrest said as soon as they were alone, his eyes taking in every detail. Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself. He smiled, some of the nervousness easing from his expression. I don't dress up often, no real cause to at the ranch. Well, I appreciate the effort. She gestured for him to sit. Would you like some tea? Actually, I'd prefer to get right to the point if that's all right with you. He remained standing, his hat in his hands. Josephine, this morning, what I said, what happened between us, I meant every word. As did I, she assured him. He took a deep breath. Then I'd like to state my intentions formally. I care for you deeply, more than I ever thought possible after. After what happened before, I want to court you properly, with marriage as the goal if you'll have me. Josephine's heart swelled at his directness, so different from Richard's calculated approach to relationships. I would be honored, Forrest. And yes, I'll have you. Relief and joy transformed his face. He crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. I know I'm not what your family would have wanted for you. I'm not educated like you, not cultured. My hands are rough from work, and there's blood on them that will never fully wash away. Your hands are strong and capable, she said, squeezing them gently. They've built a home from wilderness, protected the innocent, held me with more tenderness than I've ever known. They're exactly the hands I want holding mine for the rest of my life. Forrest brought her hands to his lips, kissing them reverently. I love you, Josephine Fletcher. I think I have since that first day when you stood up to the entire town without flinching. And I love you, Forrest Landry, she replied, her heart full to bursting. I love your courage, your honesty, your unwavering sense of justice. I love that you truly see me and value what you see. He drew her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her previous courtship experiences seem pale and lifeless by comparison. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. I should speak to your family, he said. Ask permission properly. Josephine smiled at this nod to tradition. My only family is my aunt in Boston, and I'm of age to make my own decisions. But if it would make you feel better, you could write to her. I will, he promised. And Josephine, I know this won't be easy. There will be talk, opposition. Your friend Harrington won't give up without a fight. Let them talk. Let him try, she said with newfound confidence. We've faced worse together already. The sound of someone clearing their throat made them step apart. Mrs. Wilson stood in the doorway, her expression both apologetic and amused. Excuse me, but there's someone at the door asking for Miss Fletcher. Most insistent. She glanced meaningfully at Forrest. It's that Boston gentleman again. Forrest's jaw tightened, but Josephine placed a calming hand on his arm. Let me handle this, she said quietly, then to Mrs. Wilson. Please show Mr. Harrington in. When Richard entered the parlor and saw Forrest standing beside Josephine, his face darkened. I see I'm interrupting, he said coldly. Yes, you are, Josephine replied evenly. But perhaps it's for the best. There's something you should know, Richard. She moved closer to Forrest, taking his hand deliberately. Mr. Landry and I have an understanding. We intend to marry. Richard stared at them in disbelief. You can't be serious. Josephine, this is madness. You barely know this man. I know him better than I ever knew you, she countered. I know his character, his heart. I know that he respects me as an equal, not as a possession. He's a killer, Richard burst out, his composure fracturing. Everyone in town has told me about his past, about the men he's shot, about the woman who died after being with him. Forrest took a step forward, his expression dangerous, but Josephine tightened her grip on his hand, keeping him beside her. Those stories are twisted versions of the truth, she said calmly. Forrest has killed in self-defense and to protect others, just as I did. As for Sarah Blackwood, she died in childbirth, a tragedy that happens to countless women, including my own mother. You're defending him, Richard said incredulously. You've completely lost your senses. No, Richard. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing clearly. She straightened her posture. I'm sorry you traveled all this way for nothing, but my decision is made. I'm staying in Redemption Creek and I'm going to marry Forrest Landry. Richard looked between them, his expression shifting from disbelief to cold anger. Your father would turn in his grave. My father would want me to be happy, Josephine replied steadily. And I am. Happier than I've ever been. For a long moment, Richard seemed at a loss for words. Then he straightened his shoulders, his face settling into the mask of polite indifference he wore in difficult social situations. I see there's nothing more to be said. I'll be leaving on tomorrow's stage. He looked directly at Forrest. I hope for her sake that you prove worthy of her trust. That will be my life's work, Forrest replied evenly. With a stiff bow, Richard turned and left. When the front door closed behind him, Josephine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Are you all right? Forrest asked, studying her face with concern. Yes, she assured him. Better than all right, I feel free. Christmas Day dawned clear and crisp, the Arizona desert transformed by a rare dusting of snow that had fallen during the night. Josephine gazed out the window of Mrs. Wilson's parlor, where the boarding house residents had gathered to exchange small gifts before going their separate ways for the day's celebrations. Dr. Matthews had kindly offered to drive Josephine out to Forrest's ranch, saving her from the longer journey by stagecoach. As she waited for him to arrive, she smoothed her hands over her best dress, a rich burgundy that she had carefully packed from Boston, saving it for a special occasion. The past week had been a whirlwind. Richard had departed on the stage as promised, leaving behind a formal letter releasing any claim to their understanding, a final gesture of Boston propriety that had made Josephine smile wryly. More significantly, Forrest had spoken with Reverend Thomas about performing their wedding ceremony in the spring, after the worst winter weather had passed. The Reverend had been reluctant until Dr. Matthews, and surprisingly, Mr. Roberts from the livery had vouched for Forrest's character. The town was slowly beginning to accept what was happening between the schoolteacher and the rancher, though whispers still followed them when they walked together. A knock at the door announced Dr. Matthews's arrival. Mrs. Wilson hurried to answer it, returning with both the doctor and an unexpected visitor, Emma, dressed in her Christmas finery, a small package clutched in her hands. "Miss Fletcher," the girl rushed forward. "Papa said I could come along to Mr. Landry's ranch if it's all right with you. And I made you this." She thrust the package forward eagerly. Touched, Josephine unwrapped it carefully to find a handmade bookmark embroidered with flowers and the words for Miss Fletcher with love. "It's beautiful, Emma," she said sincerely, hugging the child. "Thank you. And of course you're welcome to join us." The drive to the ranch took nearly an hour, the doctor's wagon crunching over the light snow as Emma chattered excitedly about Christmas and the gifts she had received. Josephine half listened, her anticipation growing as they approached Forrest's land. She had never visited his ranch before. As they crested a rise, she got her first full view of it, a sprawling property nestled against the base of a red rock formation. The main house was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. Several outbuildings and corrals surrounded it, and beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Landry's built it up from nothing over the years," Dr. Matthews remarked. "Started with just a claim and a tent, from what I understand." Forrest was waiting on the porch as they drove up, his face breaking into a wide smile at the sight of Josephine. He hurried down to help her from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. "Merry Christmas," he said softly, just for her. "You look lovely." "Merry Christmas," she returned, suddenly shy under his admiring gaze. "Thank you for inviting us. You brought company, I see." He nodded to Emma, who was bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Welcome, Miss Matthews. I hope you like horses." "I love horses," the girl exclaimed. "Do you have many?" "A few," Forrest replied with a smile. "Perhaps after dinner I could show you the new foal that was born last week." Emma's eyes widened with delight. "Oh yes, please." They were ushered inside, where the warmth of a crackling fire in a large stone fireplace greeted them. The interior of the house revealed a surprising blend of frontier practicality and unexpected refinement, sturdy handmade furniture alongside a few quality pieces that must have been brought from the East at considerable expense. Simple whitewashed walls adorned with a few good paintings, and bookshelves filled with well-used volumes. Mrs. Diaz, the housekeeper, greeted them warmly. A plump, grandmotherly woman with a quick smile, she had prepared a feast that filled the dining room with enticing aromas. "It's good to finally meet you, Miss Fletcher," she said, squeezing Josephine's hands. "The patron has spoken of little else but you for months." "Mrs. Diaz," Forrest warned good-naturedly, a flush creeping up his neck. The older woman merely laughed. "It's Christmas, patron. A time for truth." Dinner was a joyous affair, the conversation flowing easily among the small gathering. Dr. Matthews proved to be an entertaining storyteller, regaling them with tales from his early days as a frontier physician. Emma was on her best behavior, clearly enchanted by her surroundings and the special attention Forrest showed her. "You're good with children," Josephine observed quietly as they watched Emma helping Mrs. Diaz serve the dessert, a spectacular apple pie with cinnamon-scented crust. "I like their honesty," Forrest replied. "Children see things as they are, not as rumor or prejudice tells them to see." After the meal, true to his word, Forrest took Emma to see the foal, bundling her in a spare coat against the cold. Dr. Matthews retired to the study with a medical journal Forrest had procured for him from Tucson, leaving Josephine to explore the house more thoroughly. In the parlor, a small table held several framed photographs, a stern-looking older couple who must be Forrest's parents, a younger Forrest in a Union Army uniform, and a faded daguerreotype of a young woman with a sweet smile whom Josephine guessed must be Sarah Blackwood. The fact that he kept her picture displayed touched Josephine's heart. Whatever had happened, he had truly cared for the girl. A bookshelf nearby held volumes of history, poetry, and surprisingly, several books on art and architecture. She was examining these when Forrest returned, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Emma's helping Mrs. Diaz feed the barn cats," he explained, coming to stand beside her. "She's quite taken with the smallest one, a little calico runt." "I was admiring your book collection," Josephine said. "You never mentioned an interest in art." "There's a lot we still have to learn about each other," he acknowledged. "I've always been drawn to buildings, how they're designed, how they work with the landscape. If things had been different, perhaps I might have studied architecture." "It's not too late," she suggested. "There are schools in the East." He smiled, shaking his head. "My place is here, but I read what I can, design my own buildings when needed." He glanced toward the photographs she had been examining earlier. "You saw the pictures?" "Yes. Is that Sarah?" He nodded, his expression softening. "She deserves to be remembered. What happened wasn't her fault. She was young, pressured by her father. I held on to anger for a long time, but she paid the highest price." Josephine took his hand. "Thank you for sharing this with me. For letting me into your home, your life." Forrest lifted her hand to his lips. "I have something for you, a Christmas gift." "Oh, I have something for you as well," she remembered, retrieving a small package from her reticule, "though I'm afraid it's quite modest." "Ladies first," he insisted, presenting her with a rectangular box wrapped in simple brown paper tied with a red ribbon. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, lay a silver locket on a delicate chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny pressed wildflower on one side, the same type as had been in Emma's first day bouquet. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I remembered you mentioning that your mother had a silver locket you admired as a child, but it was sold after your father's death to pay debts," Forrest explained. "This isn't the same, of course, but—" "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, deeply moved that he had remembered such a detail from one of their conversations. "Would you help me put it on?" His fingers were gentle as he fastened the chain around her neck, brushing aside her hair with a touch that sent shivers down her spine. The locket rested just above her heart, a physical token of the connection between them. "Now yours," she said, handing him the package once he had stepped back. Forrest unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand-bound book. Opening it, he found blank pages interspersed with Josephine's neat handwriting. "It's a journal," she explained. "I've written down some of my favorite quotes about home and belonging on the first few pages. The rest is for your own thoughts, designs, whatever you wish." He ran his fingers over the supple leather cover. "This is thoughtful, Josephine. Thank you. I noticed you sketching building designs on scrap paper, she said. I thought you might appreciate somewhere proper to keep them. You notice everything, don't you? There was wonder in his voice. I notice you, she replied simply. He set the journal aside carefully, then took both her hands in his. I have something else I want to give you today if you'll accept it. Oh, this house, he said, gesturing around them. I built it larger than I needed, with more rooms than a single man requires. I think I was always building it for a family, even when I believed I'd never have one. He met her eyes directly. I want it to be your home, Josephine, our home. Not just after we're married in the spring, but now, today. She stared at him, startled. What are you saying? I'm asking you to marry me today, he clarified. Dr. Matthews brought the necessary paperwork. He's a notary as well as a physician. The Reverend doesn't need to perform the ceremony for it to be legal in the territory. He squeezed her hands gently. I know it's sudden, and if you want to wait for a proper church wedding with the town present, I understand. But when I saw you arrive today, when I watched you in this house, so perfectly at home, I knew I didn't want to wait another day to make you my wife. Josephine's heart raced. A Christmas Day wedding, small and intimate, with only their closest friends as witnesses. It was nothing like the elaborate Boston wedding she had once imagined for herself. And yet, it felt absolutely right. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. Yes, I'll marry you today. The simple ceremony took place before the fireplace in the parlor, with Dr. Matthews officiating, Emma and Mrs. Diaz as witnesses. Josephine wore her burgundy dress with the silver locket around her neck, and Forrest stood tall and proud in his best clothes, his eyes never leaving hers as they spoke their vows. I, Forrest James Landry, take you, Josephine Marie Fletcher, to be my lawful wedded wife, he said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life, to stand beside you in joy and sorrow, in plenty and want, in sickness and in health, from this day forward until death parts us. When it was her turn, Josephine's voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger with each word. I, Josephine Marie Fletcher, take you, Forrest James Landry, to be my lawful wedded husband. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life, to stand beside you in joy and sorrow, in plenty and want, in sickness and in health, from this day forward until death parts us. They had no ring that would come later, but when Dr. Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and Forrest kissed her with tender reverence, Josephine felt that no wedding in the grandest Boston cathedral could have been more perfect. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep in a guest room and Dr. Matthews had retired to another, Josephine stood with Forrest on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled Arizona sky. His arm was warm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. "Are you happy, Mrs. Landry?" he asked softly. The name sent a thrill through her. "Completely, Mr. Landry. No regrets. About the small wedding, about not waiting for spring." She turned in his arms to face him. "My only regret would have been wasting a single day we could have spent together as husband and wife." He traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "I still can't quite believe you're real, that you chose me, knowing everything." "I chose you because of everything," she corrected him. "Because every experience, every struggle has shaped you into the man I love, honorable, compassionate, stronger for having been tested." Forrest kissed her then, a kiss that held promise and passion and a future stretching out before them. When they broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "They said I was unworthy of touch," he murmured, "that my hands brought only death." Josephine took those hands in hers, pressing them to her heart. "Then let me touch heaven," she whispered back, because your touch brings me only life." Inside the warmth of their home, surrounded by the love that had grown against all odds in the harsh beauty of the Arizona territory, Forrest and Josephine Landry began their life together, a teacher who had found her voice and a rancher who had found redemption, both finally home in each other's arms. 5 years later, Josephine stood on the porch of the Landry ranch house, watching as Forrest taught their 3-year-old son James to ride his first pony. The boy's delighted laughter carried on the warm spring air, his small hands gripping the saddle horn while his father walked alongside, one hand steadying the child, the other guiding the gentle mare. So much had changed since that Christmas Day wedding. The schoolhouse in Redemption Creek had expanded to 2 rooms, with Josephine now serving as head mistress and a young teacher from California handling the younger children. The Landry Ranch had prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. And most precious of all, their family had grown. Emma Matthews, now 15, had become Josephine's apprentice teacher, spending weekends at the ranch to help with James and his 1-year-old sister Marie. The girl's natural affinity with children made her a gifted instructor, and Josephine took pride in mentoring her. The town of Redemption Creek had changed too. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing new businesses and settlers. Forrest, using his self-taught knowledge of architecture and construction, had designed several of the new buildings, including a proper town hall and an expanded church. His reputation had gradually transformed from dangerous gunman to respected businessman and family man, though he still carried a pistol when necessary and taught Josephine to improve her already formidable shooting skills. As for Jenkins and his crowd, most had either come around or moved on as the town grew and changed. Even Reverend Thomas had mellowed, particularly after Forrest donated generously to repair the church roof following a severe storm. "Mama, look," James called excitedly as the pony took a few steps on its own, Forrest still close beside them. "I'm riding." "I see you, sweetheart," Josephine called back, adjusting baby Marie on her hip. "You're doing wonderfully." The front gate opened and Dr. Matthews rode through, waving as he approached the house. Now in his 60s with silver threading his once dark hair, he remained the town's only physician and one of their dearest friends. "Good afternoon, Josephine," he greeted her, dismounting with the ease of a man much younger. "I brought those medical texts we discussed for your advanced students." "Thank you, doctor. Would you like some lemonade? Mrs. Diaz made a fresh pitcher this morning." "That sounds perfect." They settled on the porch, watching as Forrest continued the riding lesson. Marie cooed and reached for the doctor, who took her with practiced ease. "She's growing like a weed," he observed, bouncing the baby gently. "Strong like her mother." "And stubborn like her father," Josephine added with a laugh. "She's already trying to walk, holding onto furniture and taking a step or two before falling. Forrest says she'll be running the ranch before she's 10. Dr. Matthews smiled, then his expression grew more serious. "I had a letter from Boston yesterday, from your aunt." Josephine set down her lemonade. "Oh, is everything all right?" She mentioned that Richard Harrington has finally married, a senator's daughter from New York. "Good for him," Josephine said sincerely. "I hope he's happy. Your aunt also wrote that he still speaks of you occasionally. Wonders what might have been if you'd returned east." Josephine looked out at her husband and son, her heart full to bursting with love for the family they had created. "There was never any other path for me, doctor, not really." "I know that," he said gently. "Anyone who sees you and Forrest together knows that." The riding lesson concluded, and Forrest led the pony back to the small corral near the house, lifting James down to the ground. The boy immediately ran toward the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Mama, doctor, did you see? I wrote all by myself." "You certainly did," Dr. Matthews affirmed, setting Marie in her basket to free his hands for examining the boy's scrapes from an earlier fall. "You'll be a fine horseman like your father." Forrest joined them, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hat pushed back on his head. Despite the passing years and the occasional gray hair at his temples, he remained as handsome as the day Josephine had first seen him in the Silver Spoon Cafe. More so, perhaps, with the contentment that now softened his features. "How's my favorite patient?" he asked, dropping a kiss on Marie's forehead before turning to Josephine. "And my favorite teacher. We're all well," Josephine assured him, accepting his brief kiss. The doctor brought news from Boston. "Richard Harrington has married." Forrest raised an eyebrow. "Has he now?" "I hope his wife appreciates what she's got." "I'm sure she does," Josephine replied, "just as I appreciate what I have." She reached for his hand, still calloused from work but gentle in its strength. "Everything I could ever want is right here." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Josephine and Forrest sat together on a blanket beneath the stars, as they often did on clear nights. The silver locket he had given her that first Christmas still hung around her neck, now containing tiny portraits of their children alongside the preserved wildflower. "What are you thinking about?" Forrest asked, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him. "How different my life would have been if I hadn't shot that robber," she replied honestly. "If I hadn't become the woman who could kill in the eyes of the town." He considered this. "Do you ever regret it, taking a life even to save others?" "I regret that it was necessary," she said carefully. "But not that I acted. If I hadn't, I might never have met you, never known what it is to be truly loved for exactly who I am." Forrest's arm tightened around her. "When I first saw you in that cafe, looking so proper and yet so fierce, I thought to myself, there's a woman who doesn't know how extraordinary she is." Josephine smiled up at him. "And what do you think now?" "Now," he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Now I think you're beginning to understand. But I intend to spend the rest of my life reminding you just to be sure." She laughed softly, leaning into his touch. "They still whisper about us sometimes, you know. In town. The lady teacher who killed a man and the rancher with death in his hands." "Let them whisper," he said, unconcerned. "We know the truth." "Yes," Josephine agreed, looking up at the vast desert sky, at the house they had filled with love and laughter, at the man beside her who had defied superstition and judgment to build a life with her. "We do." Forrest's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "They called you unworthy of touch," she murmured, echoing the words that had become a private affirmation between them. "And you said, 'Let me touch heaven,'" he finished, bringing their joined hands to his lips. In the quiet Arizona night, surrounded by the life they had created together, Josephine Landry knew with absolute certainty that she had indeed found heaven, not in the rigid propriety of Boston society or the pages of Scripture, but in the arms of a man who had seen her strength and called it beautiful, who had touched her life and brought only joy.